There are nights when fate whispers instead of shouts, and Christmas Eve was one of them. She arrived early, elegant and composed, never imagining her entire life was about to shift. He arrived late, breathless, nervous, carrying more truth in his eyes than excuses on his lips. Two strangers, two opposite worlds, one moment that could have ended before it began. But something that night refused to let them walk away. If you think you know where this story is going, wait. Because what happened next was nothing anyone expected, and it changed both of their lives forever. The city wore Christmas like a glittering costume, pretending that every window was filled with warmth and every heart was overflowing with joy. Strings of golden lights clung to balconies, shop displays sparkled with red ribbons and artificial snow, and from somewhere in the distance, a choir's muffled carols drifted through the cold night air. People hurried along the sidewalks carrying boxes, flowers, last-minute gifts, all of them wrapped in the illusion that tonight life would be kinder. Inside one of the tallest buildings, Lucia watched all of this from behind floor-to-ceiling glass. Sipping water, she no carrier, wishing she could swallow down the emptiness instead. The city looked beautiful, yes, but it also looked like it belonged to someone else. To families, to couples, to people que realmente tenían con quien celebrar. And she, despite everything she had, did not. Her apartment, elegant and meticulously designed, glowed softly behind her. The Christmas tree in the corner had been decorated by a professional team, each ornament placed with mathematical perfection, each light calibrated to shine at just the right warmth. It was stunning, in the way hotel lobbies are stunning. Flawless, impersonal, emotionally cold. Lucia glanced at it over her shoulder and felt that familiar pinch of irony. She could buy the tallest tree, the finest ornaments, the most expensive gifts, and yet not a single object in that room could answer the one question that pulsated quietly inside her. Who would notice if I simply disappeared for a week? The thought was dramatic, she knew, but loneliness rarely followed the rules of logic. It simply sat there, heavy and patient, esperando a que alguien la mirara de frente. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, lighting up with a cheerful message from her best friend. Don't cancel. Just go. Worst case, you get a free dinner and a story to tell. Lucia let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. A blind date on Christmas Eve, if anyone else had suggested it. She habría bloqueado el número. But Brianna knew too much, knew how often Lucia regresaba sola de eventos abrotados de gente. Sabía cuántas noches terminaban con ella comiendo, sozinha en frente a televiso, still dressed in a designer gown. And Brianna was stubborn. She had insisted that this man, Alejandro, a single dad who worked in logistics, was exactly the kind of person Lucia needed to meet. Someone real. Someone whose heart had learned compassion the hard way. Lucia had rolled her eyes the first time she heard the description. It sounded like the plot of a movie she would never watch. A wealthy, guarded woman and a hard-working single father from a modest neighborhood. Where could that possibly go besides disaster? Yet, in one of those rare moments when her armor felt too tight around her ribs, she had whispered, "Fine. One dinner." And now, here she was, wearing a deep green dress that hugged her body just enough to look powerful but not desperate, touching up a sweep of lipstick in the mirror, trying not to admit que estaba nervosa. Not nervous about him, exactly. Nervous about allowing any version of hope to exist inside her, even poor Algumas Horace. Across town, in a building much older and far less glamorous, Alejandro was trying to convince his 5-year-old son that Christmas Eve was still special, even if their tree was small and their dinner simple. Mateo sat cross-legged on the floor, proudly adjusting a crooked paper star he had taped to the top of their little artificial tree for the third time. The living room smelled faintly of tomato sauce and laundry detergent, and the only lights were a mismatched string they had bought at a discount store. Yet, to Mateo, it was enough. "Papi, are you really going to a fancy restaurant?" he asked, his eyes wide with the kind of excitement Alejandro rarely felt for himself. "Will there be real candles and everything?" Alejandro laughed softly, ruffling his son's hair, and admitted that yes, there probably would be candles, though he had no idea how he would actually feel sitting among them. He had almost said no when his coworker suggested the blind date. The idea of stepping into a world that belonged to people with perfect clothes and perfect teeth seemed ridiculous. He owned exactly one decent shirt and a pair of shoes he kept as clean as he could for rare occasions, and his idea of a night out usually meant reheating leftovers after Mateo fell asleep. But his friend had insisted with the same persistence Brianna used on Lucia. "She's not like the people you're imagining," he had said. "She's tired. Like you. Just tired in a different currency." The words had stayed with Alejandro as he shaved in front of the cracked bathroom mirror, trying to tame the small details that told the story of his exhaustion. Dark circles, calloused hands, lines carved by years de trabajo pasado y preocupados silenciosos. After kissing Mateo's forehead and leaving him in the care of their elderly neighbor with a carefully prepared dinner in the fridge, Alejandro stepped into the cold night, with his heart beating a little too fast. The air bit at his face, and his breath rose in small clouds as he hurried toward the bus stop. He checked the time, once, twice, then a third time when he saw the long line of cars jammed on the main road. Public transport on Christmas Eve was more unpredictable than ever. Just his luck. He shifted from one foot to the other, thinking that maybe this was a sign, that the universe was trying to tell him he didn't belong in that kind of place, with that kind of woman. Yet every time the thought tempted him to turn back, Mateo's hopeful little voice floated through his mind. "Maybe she will be nice, Poppy." The bus finally arrived, already crowded with people carrying shopping bags and plastic containers of food. Alejandro squeezed himself inside, gripping the metal bar as the vehicle lurched forward in a series of impatient stops and starts. Outside the window, storefronts glowed softly, casting reflections over his tired features. He wondered what Lucia looked like, if she would be disappointed when she saw him. He imagined her perfectly styled, wearing something elegant, her hair shining under the restaurant lights. He pictured himself standing beside her like a smudge in an otherwise perfect painting. The thought made him swallow hard, but he refused to let shame steer his decisions tonight. He had promised himself he would show up, even if everything in him screamed that he didn't fit. Meanwhile, Lucia stepped out of the car in front of the restaurant, greeted by a burst of warmth and the soft murmur of clinking glasses and low conversation. The maitre d' recognized her last name immediately and guided her to one of the best tables without even checking the reservation list. She sat down with practiced grace, placing her clutch delicately on the chair beside her, adjusting the napkin in her lap with motions that felt more like reflex than choice. The room was beautiful. White tablecloths, golden candlelight, a towering Christmas tree glimmering in one corner. Couples leaned in close to one another. Families laughed gently between courses. It should have felt festive. Instead, it felt like she had stepped onto a stage where everyone else knew their lines, and she had forgotten hers. She checked the time. His arrival hour had already come and gone. 5 minutes late, then 10, then 15. With each passing minute, the familiar script tried to reclaim her heart. Of course he didn't come. Of course this was a mistake. Of course you expected too much from something you never should have wanted. She could already imagine the explanation Brianna would offer, the way her friends would shrug and say, "Men are like that." But tonight, Lucia was too tired for cynical jokes. She was tired of being disappointed and pretending it didn't hurt. Her hand drifted toward her purse again, muscles tensing to stand up and leave, when the doors at the front of the restaurant opened and a man stepped in, looking around with an expression that was equal parts apology and awe. And in that single breath of hesitation before she recognized him, the story of this Christmas Eve held its breath as well. Lucia had not always been the composed, impenetrable woman who entered every room like someone who expected nothing and demanded even less. She had once been a child who believed in small miracles, who waited by the window for her parents to come home early enough to read her a story or ask how her day had gone, but those evenings rarely came. Her father's empire grew in proportion to his absence, and her mother's beauty remained flawless while her affection withered like a garden left untended. What Lucia learned from that childhood was not the meaning of love, but the meaning of performance. Smile beautifully, sit perfectly, speak intelligently, never need too much, never ask for warmth, never let anyone see the longing flicker behind your ribs. Over time, she became a masterpiece admired by many, held by none, sculpted by expectations she never had the courage to deny. In her early adulthood, love approached her in forms that looked convincing, but dissolved the moment she reached out for something real. The men she dated admired her ambition, and some even adored her charm, but none of them ever touched the quiet center of her life, where loneliness curled up like a sleeping animal. They brought her roses instead of reassurance, invitations instead of intimacy, compliments instead of commitment. At first, she tried to adjust her desires, convincing herself that this was simply how relationships worked among people of her status: elegant, efficient, emotionally hollow. But eventually that hollow became an ache, and the ache became a numbness she carried with invisible grace. She had tried therapy once, sitting in a minimalist office that smelled faintly of eucalyptus, where she admitted with a brittle voice that she felt unseen in rooms where everyone claimed to adore her. The therapist had said something she never forgot: "People cannot love what you don't allow them to see." The words struck her like a truth wrapped in accusation. Lucia had spent years polishing the armor that shielded her from disappointment, not realizing it also shielded her from connection. She stopped going to therapy after a few sessions, telling herself she was too busy, too important, too focused on her work. But in truth, she wasn't ready to dismantle the fortress she had built one stone at a time. Instead, she embraced success with a fervor that bordered on desperation. Every accolade became a substitute for affection. Every career milestone a bandage over wounds she didn't dare examine. She became a woman others envied, whispered about, praised. A woman with flawless posture, tailored dresses, measured words, and a reputation for being unshakable. But beneath the idol others projected onto her, Lucia felt herself slowly turning into a sculpture: beautiful, respected, admired, and cold. Very cold. She began to believe that love, at least the kind that feels soft and safe, was simply something she had aged out of. Her romantic history only reinforced this belief. She dated executives, heirs, entrepreneurs, artists, men who dazzled but never stayed. Some were intimidated by her strength. Others were enthralled with her image but uninterested in the vulnerable woman hidden beneath. A few tried to mold her into something more convenient, asking her to be less ambitious, less opinionated, less her. Lucia discovered that heartbreak didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came as a subtle erosion, a slow dissolving of hope until she could no longer recall what hope used to feel like. So when Brianna suggested a blind date, Lucia had laughed, a soft, elegant sound that masked genuine disbelief. She wasn't opposed to meeting new people, but she had abandoned the romantic fantasy that someone might see beyond the polished exterior. Still, Brianna persisted, confident that this man, Alejandro, a hardworking single father, carried a sincerity that money could not buy. At first, Lucia dismissed the idea as sentimental nonsense, something her friend invented out of affection. But the seed had been planted, and over the following days, she found herself wondering what it would be like to sit across from someone who wasn't rehearsing his best self for her approval. Unexpectedly, that curiosity grew into something more unsettling: longing. Not for Alejandro in particular. She had never met him, but for the possibility of meeting someone unpolished, unpretentious, unburdened by the performative expectations of her social class. Someone whose kindness was not strategic, whose interest was not transactional, whose affection was not conditional. She began to imagine what it would feel like to be looked at without calculation, to be spoken to sin filtros, to be valued for reasons that did not appear on a financial statement. And though she didn't admit it aloud, that fragile longing was what finally pushed her to accept the date. The day of the meeting, she prepared herself with the same precision she used for business dinners: shower, hair, makeup, dress selection. Yet something felt different as she moved through the ritual. There was a tremor beneath her ribs, not of fear, but of unfamiliar anticipation. She found herself wondering what kind of father Alejandro was, what his laugh sounded like, what stories carved the lines on his hands. She wondered if he would be intimidated by her, or if he would treat her with the same quiet respect Brianna insisted he carried in everything he did. Most of all, she wondered whether she had finally grown tired enough of loneliness to risk letting her guard slip, even a fraction. When she arrived at the restaurant, the world responded to her presence in predictable ways. Doors opened, voices softened, eyes sparkled with recognition, but none of it satisfied her. She was weary of superficial reverence. She wanted something gentler, truer, less polished. Sitting at the table, she felt the weight of her own contradictions, a woman adored by many yet touched by none, powerful enough to shape empires yet powerless against her own longing. The clock ticked, each minute deepening the quiet disappointment pooling in her chest, and she wondered whether she had been foolish to hope at all. But beneath her growing frustration, something softer fought to remain alive. It was faint, like the flicker of a candle in a draft, fragile, unpredictable, insistent. It whispered that perhaps the date hadn't been ruined, that perhaps lateness didn't equal indifference, that perhaps she still deserved a night that didn't end in resignation. And when the doors opened and a breathless man stepped inside, disheveled, nervous, undeniably human, that faint hope rose just enough to catch her attention, just enough to make her stay seated, just enough to allow the possibility that love, the version she once believed in as a child, might not be entirely lost after all. Alejandro had grown up in a world far removed from polished silverware, velvet chairs, and quiet restaurants where people whispered instead of shouted. His childhood unfolded in a neighborhood where walls were thin, arguments traveled through hallways like restless spirits, and dreams were luxuries reserved for people who didn't have to choose between rent and groceries. He learned early that responsibility wasn't a concept, but a survival skill, something you carried in your hands, on your shoulders, and inside your ribs. At 10, he was already helping his mother clean offices at night, mopping floors while she scrubbed sinks, both of them too tired to speak, but too determined to give up. By the time he reached adulthood, the rhythm of sacrifice beat in him like a second heartbeat, steady and unquestioned, the only rhythm he had ever known. Despite the hardships, Alejandro was never bitter. Hardship had shaped him, yes, but it had not twisted him. His friends often told him he had something rare, an instinctive gentleness that refused to decay under pressure. He didn't know where it came from, only that it had always been there, guiding him quietly. That same gentleness is what made him fall in love years ago, when he met a woman who carried sadness in her smile and hope in her eyes. Their connection had been immediate, sincere, and in many ways naive. They clung to each other like two branches bending in the same storm. But storms don't ask if love is ready before they begin tearing things apart. The early days of his relationship had felt like stepping into sunlight after living in permanent shade. She brought laughter to their small apartment, laughter that echoed through the cracked walls and made even their empty refrigerator seem less threatening. They shared more dreams than furniture, more affection than money, and for a time, it was enough. But life is not sustained by romance alone. Bills multiplied, work hours increased, exhaustion settled in like a third presence in their home. The arguments started quietly, tiny disagreements over chores or money, but grief has a way of sharpening the smallest blade. Soon, love began to shrink under the weight of survival. When she became pregnant, they both hoped that a child would anchor them back to the softness they once shared. And for a brief moment, it worked. They held hands more, whispered more, imagined futures that didn't involve overdue payments or secondhand baby clothes. But the pressure didn't disappear. It intensified. Alejandro took extra shifts, leaving early and returning late, while she battled emotional storms she didn't know how to name. The more he tried to provide, the more distant he became. The more she needed support, the more alone she felt. Bit by bit, they drifted into parallel lives within the same small apartment. Mateo's birth was the most beautiful and terrifying day of Alejandro's life. Holding his son, tiny, warm, impossibly fragile, ignited a love in him fierce enough to reshape his entire existence. But even that miracle wasn't enough to mend what had been unraveling for months. His partner cried often, not because she didn't love Mateo, but because she felt swallowed by responsibilities she never expected to bear. Alejandro tried to be her anchor, but he, too, was drowning in exhaustion. The day she left, she pressed her forehead against his and said, through tears, that she wasn't abandoning them. She was escaping herself. He didn't resent her. He only wished the world had been kinder to them both. Raising Mateo alone became a purpose so overwhelming and sacred that Alejandro rarely questioned it. He woke before dawn to prepare breakfast, walked his son to school holding his tiny hand, worked shifts that left his muscles aching, and returned home to cook, bathe, and comfort a child who saw him as the entire universe. And though Alejandro was grateful for every moment, the fatigue was constant. An ache in his bones, a shadow beneath his eyes, a tightness in his chest whenever he wondered whether he was enough. Still, every time Mateo laughed or wrapped his arms around his neck, Alejandro knew that no sacrifice was too heavy. But sacrifice comes with a price, and for Alejandro, that price was isolation. He stopped going out, stopped meeting friends, stopped even imagining a life that included romance or companionship. His world narrowed to two people, himself and his son. The idea of dating felt impractical, almost selfish. What woman would want a man who sometimes fell asleep sitting upright? Who counted coins before buying bread? Who carried invisible bruises from years of being overlooked, underestimated, and overworked? He convinced himself that love was a luxury he was not meant to afford. Until one day, his coworker, an older woman who treated him like a son, approached him with a mischievous spark in her eye. She told him about a woman she knew, someone remarkable, someone wounded in ways that mirrored his own. A woman who needed sincerity, not wealth. Patience, not perfection. Alejandro laughed at first, shaking his head, stuffing his hands into his pockets to hide the sudden nervous energy tightening his fingers. "She's way out of my league," he said. His friend responded with a firmness that startled him. "No one is out of your league when kindness is your language." After days of persuasion, and after noticing the hopeful glimmer in Mateo's eyes whenever he mentioned the idea, Alejandro finally said yes. The decision terrified him more than he admitted, because agreeing to meet someone meant acknowledging the one thing he had tried to bury for years. He still wanted companionship. He still longed for a voice beside his at the end of the day, for someone to talk to, someone who might understand that love is sometimes built from broken edges. As the date approached, he felt something unfamiliar growing inside him. Not hope exactly, but the shy beginning of it. So when he rushed out of the apartment that Christmas Eve, hair not quite settled, shirt ironed 3 times to hide its age, breath quick with both fear and determination, Alejandro wasn't just going to a blind date. He was stepping toward a version of himself he had forgotten existed. A man who could be seen, a man who could be chosen, a man worthy of tenderness. He didn't know what would happen that night, whether she would like him, whether he would embarrass himself, whether destiny had a sense of humor or cruelty. He only knew one thing. Showing up already felt like an act of courage. And for the first time in years, courage and hope walked beside him under the cold glow of Christmas Eve. The evening had begun with more promise than Alejandro allowed himself to acknowledge. But Christmas Eve had a way of testing even the strongest resolve. When he left his apartment, the air was crisp and sharp, filled with the scent of fireplaces and distant holiday cooking, the kind of night that made people feel hopeful. Except Alejandro didn't have time for sentiment. He was already behind schedule, and every block he hurried past reminded him how fragile the moment was. Buses were late, streets were crowded, and families moved in cheerful flocks that slowed everything to a crawl. He checked the time again, felt the familiar sinking in his chest, and forced himself to walk faster even though his legs were already aching from the long shift at work. The world seemed determined to remind him that he belonged to a different rhythm, one where nothing came easily, not even being on time. At the bus stop, the crowd swelled with restless impatience. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, teenagers clutched gift bags, elderly couples leaned on one another for warmth. Everyone looked like they were going somewhere meaningful. Alejandro tightened his grip on the strap of his worn jacket, resisting the wave of self-consciousness rising in him. He wasn't dressed like them. He didn't carry the effortless confidence of someone who fit naturally into holiday celebrations. Instead, he carried the weight of a father who had left his son with a careful promise. "Papi will be back soon." Each passing minute made him feel like he was failing not just his date, but Mateo too. What kind of example was he setting if he couldn't even do this right? When the bus finally screeched to a halt, already jam-packed, he squeezed inside with the determination of someone who refused to give up, yet fear nipped at the back of his mind. He imagined Lucia, sitting at a beautifully decorated table, glancing toward the entrance with growing disappointment, perhaps even irritation. He pictured her lifting one graceful hand to check a delicate watch before deciding that he wasn't worth waiting for. The thought carved a tight ache beneath his ribs. He wanted, needed to prove that he wasn't the kind of man who didn't show up. He might not have money, luxury, or polish, but he had sincerity. He had intention. He had a heart that tried, even when life made trying feel foolish. Traffic barely moved as the bus crawled through the glowing streets. Bright displays of red and gold blurred past the windows, casting festive reflections across Alejandro's tense face. People around him chatted about gifts, dinners, and midnight traditions. He listened silently, feeling like an observer of a life he had never been invited to participate in. He imagined Lucia surrounded by refinement, by a world where lateness was a sign of disrespect, not the result of a system stacked against you. He swallowed hard, feeling the familiar sting of inadequacy pressing against his throat. Still, he refused to get off the bus. Even if he had to arrive breathless and trembling, he would arrive. When the bus doors finally opened near the restaurant district, Alejandro stepped out into a swirl of cold wind and glittering lights. His heart thudded heavily as he looked around, searching for the polished entrance he had memorized from the photo his coworker had shown him. People moved past him in expensive coats, laughing easily, unaware of the man standing among them trying to gather enough courage to walk into a place that looked like it charged more for a napkin than he earned in an hour. He wiped his palms on his pants, straightened his shirt, and drew in a deep breath that did little to calm his nerves. Every instinct whispered turn back, but he ignored all of them. Inside the restaurant, Lucia sat as still as a painting. The delicate rise and fall of candlelight glowed against her green dress, illuminating her in soft golds and warm shadows. Her posture remained perfect, rooted in the discipline she carried everywhere, but her heart felt unsteady. She had already rehearsed a dozen excuses she could give her friend the next day. He wasn't serious. He forgot. I knew it wouldn't work. Yet beneath all the elegant resignation, something more fragile stirred, something that felt suspiciously like disappointment laced with longing. Every time the doors opened, her eyes flicked up despite herself, and every time they closed without revealing him, a small bruise formed in her chest. Back outside, Alejandro stood frozen at the entrance, staring at his blurred reflection in the glass. His hair was wind-tossed from running, his jacket slightly crooked from the bus ride, his shoes dull next to the polished marble beneath his feet. He felt like a man wandering into a world that had no room for him. But then he remembered the way Mateo had grinned as he said, "You look handsome, Poppy." That small voice, full of trust, pushed him forward. With trembling fingers, he pulled open the door, stepping into a world of warm lighting, soft music, and clinking crystal. A world that felt too delicate for his calloused hands. The maitre d' approached with polite curiosity, looking him up and down with the subtle scrutiny of someone trained to read social hierarchies at a glance. Alejandro's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as he gave his name, half expecting the man to shake his head and send him away. Instead, the maitre d' nodded, maintaining professionalism, and gestured toward the far side of the room. Alejandro followed the direction with his eyes, and there she was. Lucia, stunning, elegant, untouchable. For a moment, he forgot how to breathe, overwhelmed by the sharp contrast between her polished beauty and his exhausted appearance. As he approached, Lucia lifted her gaze. Their eyes locked, and something happened, something subtle but undeniable. The disappointment she had been holding began to soften, and the shame Alejandro carried seemed to loosen its grip. He stopped beside the table, chest rising and falling too quickly, hands slightly trembling. He could have offered an elaborate excuse, but instead he chose the truth, delivered in a voice roughened by nerves and sincerity. "I'm sorry for being late. I truly tried." The honesty in his eyes was so raw, so unguarded, that it pierced straight through Lucia's practiced composure. In that suspended breath between apology and forgiveness, the night tilted. Not dramatically, not in a way others would notice, but in a way that carved a new beginning into the quiet space between them. The disappointment in Lucia's chest loosened, the fear in Alejandro's heart eased. A simple gesture, a slight nod from her, extended the invitation he had been praying for. And as he carefully sat across from her, still catching his breath, neither of them realized that this small moment, born from delay and doubt, would become the turning point of a story neither believed they deserved. Christmas Eve had tested them both, but it had also delivered them to each other. For a moment that stretched longer than Alejandro could endure, Lucia simply looked at him, her expression unreadable beneath the soft glow of the restaurant's golden lights. She had rehearsed 100 responses while waiting, responses polished enough to shield her pride and elegant enough to close the evening without appearing wounded. But none of them fit the man standing before her, breathless, apologetic, visibly nervous, yet profoundly sincere. His lateness, which had initially felt like a personal insult, began to reframe itself in her mind as she took in the exhaustion in his shoulders and the earnestness in his eyes. It was not disrespect. It was life, his life, written plainly across his features. And for the first time in a long time, Lucia felt her carefully guarded composure tremble. Alejandro stood unsure of where he belonged, beside her, across from her, or back outside in the cold night where he could vanish without disturbing her world. He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit formed from years of trying not to take up space where he wasn't wanted. His breath caught when she continued to watch him in silence. Maybe she regrets agreeing to this, he thought. Maybe I should leave before she has to ask me to. But just as he began to step back, preparing to apologize once more and retreat, Lucia's voice, soft, calm, surprisingly gentle, cut through the tension. "Please," she said, motioning to the chair across from her, "sit." Those 4 letters felt like a door cracking open in a place he thought was locked to him. He sank into the chair with cautious gratitude, still half expecting her to change her mind. Lucia exhaled quietly, releasing a tension she hadn't noticed had gathered in her shoulders. The truth was, she wasn't entirely sure why she hadn't stood up and left earlier. Habit would have told her to protect her pride, to avoid vulnerability, to treat lateness as proof of unreliability. But something in Alejandro's expression had stopped her. The sincerity, the humility, the rawness she had never once seen in the polished men who moved through her usual social circles. His apology had not been rehearsed, it had been real. And real was something she had not encountered in a long time. The waiter approached, ready to take orders, but Lucia lifted one hand delicately, signaling that they needed more time. Alejandro swallowed hard, feeling unworthy of the space he occupied. He began unraveling a series of explanations in a rushed voice. Work delays, the crowded bus, the need to ensure his son was safe with the neighbor, but Lucia raised her hand again, just slightly, and whispered, "Breathe." The simple word stunned him. He obeyed instinctively, pulling air into lungs that had been too tight since he left home. That small moment, her calming him allowing it, shifted something intangible between them, something neither understood but both felt. "Do you want to start over?" she asked quietly, and the question nearly broke him. He nodded, unable to form words without betraying how deeply the offer affected him. Lucia leaned forward a fraction, enough to signal openness, but not so much as to expose vulnerability she wasn't ready to admit. "Tell me," she said, "about your son." Alejandro blinked in surprise, not expecting that to be her first question. But as soon as he spoke Mateo's name, his entire posture changed. His shoulders lifted, his eyes brightened, his voice softened with unmistakable affection. He described Mateo not as a burden or an obligation, but as a source of joy, as the small heartbeat that kept him moving through exhaustion, doubt, and fear. Lucia listened, truly listened, her expression thawing with each word Alejandro spoke. She found herself fascinated by the tenderness in his tone, the honesty in his stories, the pride he carried in simple moments like teaching Mateo how to tie his shoes or reading him bedtime stories when he was too tired to keep his eyes open. These weren't achievements meant to impress. They were pieces of a man who lived not for himself, but for someone he loved deeply. It occurred to her then, and startled her, that strength could exist without wealth, that value could be measured in devotion rather than accomplishments. After a while, Alejandro hesitated, suddenly aware of how much he had said. His voice grew small as he asked, "I'm sorry, is this too much?" Lucia shook her head slowly, something warm flickering behind her eyes. "No," she answered, "it's honest. Honest." She repeated the words silently to herself, tasting its unfamiliar simplicity. She had spent so many years navigating conversations built on pretense, ambition, and social positioning. But here, in front of her, sat a man speaking from his heart, without filtering his truth. And instead of recoiling, she felt herself leaning into it, drawn by a quiet gravity she hadn't expected. When the waiter returned and took their orders, the evening shifted subtly but unmistakably. Lucia no longer held herself rigidly. Her posture softened, her gaze warmed, her voice moved with a gentleness she hadn't shown a stranger in years. Alejandro noticed these changes with a mix of awe and caution, afraid of misreading her openness, yet profoundly grateful for it. The table that had once felt like a barrier between them now felt more like a shared space. A fragile but growing bridge connecting two lives shaped by very different circumstances, but equally shaped by loneliness. As they waited for their meals, Lucia made a decision, not spoken, not even consciously formed, but deeply felt. She chose to stay, not out of politeness or pity, but because something inside her recognized that leaving would mean closing a door that had only just begun to open. Alejandro, though unaware of her internal resolve, sensed the shift. The tension drained from his shoulders, replaced by cautious hope. He began to smile, not the shy, apologetic smile he had worn upon arrival, but a genuine one, warm and unguarded. And in that quiet, tender moment, Lucia realized something profound. His lateness no longer mattered. The story she had built around it, the assumptions, the judgments, the defenses, dissolved under the weight of who he truly was. She found herself unexpectedly grateful that she hadn't walked away, grateful that the night had not gone as planned, grateful that imperfect timing had delivered her a man unlike anyone she had ever met. As the soft glow of Christmas lights reflected in her eyes, she knew she had made the right decision. She stayed. And because she did, the night would unfold into something neither of them could have imagined. The moment their meals arrived, something in the atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that overtook the room, but in the subtle way a quiet truth slips into a conversation without asking permission. Lucia watched Alejandro thank the waiter with a sincerity rare in a restaurant accustomed to perfunctory politeness, and the simplicity of that gesture disarmed her. She had spent years dining with men who treated service workers like furniture, never acknowledging the person behind the action. But Alejandro's expression, warm and grateful, revealed a type of respect that was instinctive rather than performed. Lucia found herself studying him, his hands, marked with work, his posture, humble yet steady, his eyes, soft even when tired, and she felt something inside her soften too, as though a layer of frost she had accepted as permanent was beginning to melt. Alejandro, meanwhile, tried to ground himself in the moment, reminding his heart to slow down. Sitting across from Lucia felt surreal, almost dreamlike. She radiated elegance with every movement, yet her presence didn't intimidate him as much as he expected. There was something quiet in her eyes, something fragile beneath the polished exterior she carried with such discipline. He noticed how her fingers brushed lightly against the stem of her glass, how her shoulders rose and fell with breaths she tried to disguise as nonchalant. For the first time, he realized she wasn't just a woman out of his league. She was a woman burdened by loneliness so deep that wealth couldn't shield her from it. And in recognizing that, his fears softened into empathy. Their conversation began cautiously, like two travelers approaching a narrow bridge from opposite ends. Alejandro spoke about his job in logistics, the long shifts, the unpredictable hours, the camaraderie that kept him sane during the toughest days. Lucia listened with genuine interest, not out of politeness but curiosity. In her world, conversations revolved around negotiations, networking, and influence. Hearing someone talk about honest labor with pride, rather than resentment, felt refreshing. She asked questions, many questions, about his responsibilities, his team, his daily routines. And the more she asked, the more Alejandro felt his guard easing, as though her interest gave him permission to exist without apology. When the spotlight shifted, Lucia hesitated. Speaking about herself always felt like stepping onto a stage, expected to perform a version of reality curated for admiration. But tonight, admiration felt irrelevant. She took a breath and began describing her career, not the glamorous highlights people envied, but the sacrifices that built them. The long nights, the constant pressure, the loneliness hidden behind success. Alejandro listened closely, not impressed by her wealth, but moved by the exhaustion she tried so hard to mask. He didn't interrupt with compliments or flattery. Instead, he offered quiet understanding, the kind that had nothing to do with status and everything to do with empathy. "What's the hardest part?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the kind of sincerity that didn't demand vulnerability but invited it. Lucia paused, feeling her throat tighten with a truth she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. "Being admired," she finally said, surprising even herself. "But not known." Alejandro's expression shifted, not confused, but painfully aware. He nodded slowly, as though he understood exactly what she meant. And in that moment, Lucia realized how starved she was for someone who could decipher her meaning without requiring translation. She wasn't sure whether to feel exposed or relieved, but the relief won, settling gently in her chest like warmth after a long cold. The conversation deepened, stretching into places neither expected. They spoke about childhood, his filled with noise, chaos, and struggle, hers filled with silence, distance, and polished expectations. They spoke about disappointment, his shaped by limitations, hers shaped by emotional absence. They spoke about dreams, Alejandro wishing for stability, for a chance to give Mateo a life without constant worry. Lucia wishing for connection, for someone who saw her instead of the image she projected. Their stories, though drastically different on the surface, revealed the same ache beneath, a longing for something real, something gentle, something human. Alejandro found himself laughing unexpectedly when Lucia admitted she had once burned a frozen pizza because she forgot to remove the cardboard. She flushed with embarrassment, but the authenticity of her confession delighted him. It made her feel less unreachable, more real. In return, he told her about the time he accidentally dyed all his laundry pink because a red sock had snuck into the wash. She laughed, a genuine, melodic laugh that turned heads from nearby tables. The sound surprised her. It had been months since laughter felt natural rather than performative. And hearing it, Alejandro felt something settle into place, a quiet sense of ease, as though they had stepped into a space free from judgment. There were silences too, not awkward, but soft, comfortable pauses where words weren't necessary. Moments where they simply observed each other, absorbing the small gestures that defined them more deeply than any biography ever could. Alejandro noticed the way Lucia's eyes softened whenever she listened, how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she grew thoughtful. Lucia noticed how Alejandro's hands moved when he spoke, expressive yet humble, how his smile appeared slowly, like something he wasn't used to giving freely but offered anyway. The waiter refilled their glasses, the restaurant buzzed with holiday cheer, and outside, snow began to fall in slow, deliberate flakes. Neither of them noticed the passing time. Their worlds, so different, so distant, had merged into a bubble of warmth where nothing outside the table seemed to matter. Alejandro felt lighter with every minute, carrying a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. Lucia felt anchored for the first time in a long time, grounded by a man who saw her not as a symbol, but as a person. And though neither said it aloud, both understood that the evening had crossed into something meaningful. As plates emptied and conversations wove deeper threads, Lucia realized with startling clarity that she no longer cared how the night had begun. Alejandro's lateness had become irrelevant, swallowed by the sincerity he carried and the connection they were discovering. What mattered was the way he looked at her, with honesty, not calculation, with curiosity, not expectation. And what mattered for him was the way she saw him, without condescension, without judgment, without pity. Something fragile but undeniable had begun growing between them. And whether it blossomed or broke, both felt silently grateful for the unexpected miracle unfolding on Christmas Eve. The longer they talked, the more the world outside the restaurant seemed to disappear, as if time itself had paused to grant them a sanctuary they didn't know they needed. Lucia, who usually measured her evenings in minutes and obligations, found herself forgetting the hour entirely. Alejandro, who spent most nights counting how many hours of sleep he could afford before the next shift, surrendered to the rare luxury of not worrying. A strange warmth bloomed between them, not romantic yet, not defined, but undeniably alive. It felt like watching two distant stars draw gradually closer, shedding the cold around them. Lucia felt her pulse settle into a gentler rhythm, while Alejandro felt his breathing deepen, no longer restrained by fear of misstepping. Lucia was the first to notice the snow gathering outside the large windows. The flakes fell slowly, swirling like tiny dancers illuminated by the warm street lamps. Her gaze drifted toward them, and the softness in her eyes caught Alejandro by surprise. She looked peaceful in that moment, almost childlike in her quiet awe, and he found himself wondering how many times she had stood behind cold windows wishing to feel something other than loneliness. When she noticed him watching, she smiled, small, subtle, but enough to make his chest tighten. "I used to love the snow," she murmured, her voice vulnerable, "before life became too loud for me to hear it." Alejandro nodded gently, understanding more than she expected. He told her how snow made Mateo excited beyond reason, how the little boy pressed his face against the glass every winter morning hoping to see white rooftops, how he once ran outside without shoes just to feel the first snowfall. Lucia listened with an expression that balanced admiration and longing. "He sounds wonderful," she whispered. Alejandro's eyes softened. He's the best part of my life." That tender declaration carried a weight that moved something deep inside her. She had never met Mateo, yet she felt strangely connected to him through Alejandro's words, as if the love that shaped the boy's world was somehow reshaping hers. Their worlds, though undeniably different, began finding unexpected intersections. Lucia spoke about the pressure of high society, the constant scrutiny masked behind polite smiles, the suffocating expectations of people who believed wealth exempted you from sadness. Alejandro listened attentively, realizing for the first time that loneliness was not exclusive to poverty. It lived in penthouses as much as it lived in small apartments. "It must be exhausting," he said quietly, not with pity but with understanding. She nodded, her throat tightening. "It is. People see me, but they don't see me." Alejandro leaned slightly forward, his voice soft but steady. "I see you." Those 3 words, simple yet deeply human, almost unraveled her. In turn, she learned that Alejandro's strength came from necessity, not choice. He explained how he rationed energy the way some people ration money, how every decision revolved around what was best for Mateo, how he often hid his own fears to avoid burdening others. Lucia felt admiration grow in her chest. Real admiration, not the superficial kind she gave to men who flaunted success. Alejandro didn't flaunt anything. He simply lived truthfully. And truth, it seemed, was exactly what her polished world lacked. She realized that she had spent years surrounded by people who performed strength but rarely lived it. Alejandro, however, embodied it in every breath. The contrast between their lives should have been jarring, yet it created harmony instead of conflict. Lucia spoke about charity galas she attended out of obligation, while Alejandro talked about community events where neighbors cooked and shared meals in crowded courtyards. She confessed that she often felt misplaced among rich circles, while he admitted he sometimes felt invisible among crowds that rushed past him without noticing. Each confession stitched a new connection between them, invisible but strong, weaving their differences into a tapestry that somehow made perfect sense. They were 2 halves of a story they hadn't known they were writing. Lucia slowly realized she wasn't just drawn to Alejandro. She trusted him. Trusted his kindness, his simplicity, his humility. Trusted that he meant every word he said, even the uncertain ones. That trust felt unfamiliar, almost frightening. Yet it also felt liberating. She didn't have to filter her emotions around him. She didn't have to posture or impress. She didn't have to pretend the silence didn't hurt or the pressure didn't suffocate her. For the first time in years, she was speaking without hiding behind polished phrasing. And Alejandro, without fully understanding the magnitude of what he offered, gave her the space to be unguarded. Alejandro, on the other hand, discovered that Lucia was not the distant, unattainable woman he had imagined while rushing to the restaurant. Her elegance was real, yes, but it was layered atop a quiet gentleness he hadn't anticipated. She asked about his dreams with genuine interest, not the dismissive politeness he was accustomed to receiving. She held his gaze without condescension, without pity, without impatience. And the more he observed her, the more he realized she wasn't surrounded by wealth. She was trapped by it. Something inside him reached toward her, not to rescue her, but to understand her. At one point, Lucia grew silent, her eyes drifting toward her untouched glass of wine. The pause stretched long enough for Alejandro to worry he had said something wrong. "What are you thinking?" he asked carefully. She inhaled deeply before answering. "That maybe we're not as different as I thought." His brows rose slightly in surprise. To him, their worlds were practically galaxies apart. But her words held a kind of truth that neither of them had fully realized until now. They were both carrying invisible weights. They were both tired of pretending. They both longed for connection that didn't demand performance or apology. And somehow, in the gentle glow of a Christmas Eve dinner, they had found it. As their eyes met again, softly, steadily, a quiet certainty settled between them. They didn't have a future yet, not a defined one, not a promised one. But they had this moment, raw, honest, unexpectedly tender. Two people who should never have crossed paths now discovered that fate, in its strange wisdom, had woven their loneliness into a shared silence that felt like belonging. And though neither spoke it aloud, both understood that something had shifted inside them. Their worlds, once separate and sealed, had begun to open. And on this night of miracles, neither wished to close the door again. As the night deepened, the restaurant gradually shifted from bustling energy to a softer, more intimate calm. Candles flickered lower, conversations dimmed into murmurs, and the waitstaff moved quietly between tables, respectful of the moments unfolding around them. Yet for Lucia and Alejandro, the world beyond their table had already disappeared hours earlier. They were caught in the rare symmetry of a connection neither had expected, a connection that felt both fragile and strangely inevitable. Each word exchanged seemed to peel back another layer of misunderstanding, revealing two souls who had spent too long believing they were unworthy of being seen. And with every passing minute, Lucia felt increasingly drawn to the earnestness in Alejandro's eyes, while Alejandro felt humbled by the gentleness blooming in hers. At one point, Lucia leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him the way someone observes a truth they hadn't realized they were longing for. His face was peaceful in the candlelight, even beautiful in its own understated way, lined with exhaustion, yes, but also with resilience. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said softly. Alejandro tensed for a moment, but nodded. She hesitated before continuing. "When you walked in, what were you afraid of?" Her question was not casual curiosity. It carried the weight of someone searching for understanding, someone who sensed the deeper story behind a person's nervous smile. Alejandro looked down at his hands, tracing the groove of his calluses with his thumb, gathering the courage to answer with the honesty she deserved. "I was afraid," he admitted quietly, "that you'd look at me and wish I hadn't come." The admission struck her with unexpected force. She opened her mouth to respond, but he continued before she could, his voice trembling with vulnerability. "I know who I am. I know what I can offer. And I also know what I can't. I thought maybe you'd see all of that at once and decide I wasn't worth your time." His words were not laced with bitterness, only truth, a truth shaped by years of living in a world that rarely gave him the benefit of the doubt. Lucia felt something warm and painful tighten in her chest. She wanted to reach across the table and erase every moment that had made him believe such things. "Look at me," she whispered softly. When his eyes lifted to meet hers, she held them with a steady, unflinching tenderness. "I didn't stay because of obligation. I stayed because when you walked in, I saw sincerity. Not pretense, not polished charm, not the arrogance I'm so used to. I saw someone real." Her voice trembled slightly, and for a moment, she wasn't the composed woman who commanded rooms with her confidence. She was simply a person trying to reassure another that he mattered. Alejandro swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the simple kindness in her words, a kindness he rarely received from strangers, especially not from someone as poised as her. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing as her words settled into him. "You're different from what I imagined," he confessed. "I thought you'd be." He faltered, embarrassed. Lucia offered a small, gentle smile. "Untouchable." He nodded sheepishly. "Yes, but you're not. You're—" He searched for the right word, one that didn't feel presumptuous or foolish. "Human." Lucia's breath caught. No compliment had ever pierced her as deeply as that simple word. She had been praised for beauty, intelligence, refinement, but rarely, if ever, for her humanity. She realized then how desperately she craved to be seen not as an icon of success, but as a woman with wounds and hopes like anyone else. Their plates were cleared, but neither noticed. They were lost in the kind of conversation that pulls two lives into alignment without either participant realizing when the shift began. Lucia admitted things she rarely shared. How exhausting it was to maintain an image, how often she felt isolated at events where she was supposed to shine, how she sometimes envied people with simpler lives because simplicity often carried a depth she missed. Alejandro listened without judgment, absorbing her words with the compassion of someone who understood that emotional pain was not measured by income. In return, he shared his fear of failing his son, his longing to give Mateo opportunities he himself never had, and the quiet grief of raising a child without someone to share the journey with. For Lucia, each confession made Alejandro more endearing, more remarkable. She found herself leaning forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, drawn to him as if gravity itself had shifted. She watched the way his eyes softened when he spoke about Mateo, how his smile widened when he described a funny moment from earlier in the week. There was no ego in him, no embellishment, just truth. And she realized, with a slow blooming clarity, that this sincerity was rarer than any luxury she possessed. It was something her life had been starved of, something she had abandoned hope of ever finding again. Alejandro, on the other hand, could hardly comprehend how a woman like Lucia, elegant, composed, stunning, could appear so vulnerable, so earnest, so real. She was nothing like the caricature he had imagined while rushing to the restaurant. Instead, she was warm in ways she didn't realize, thoughtful in ways that felt intimate, and unexpectedly gentle in ways that softened his own defenses. He felt himself wanting to memorize the way her lips curved when she smiled, the way her brows drew together slightly when she listened deeply, the way her voice softened when she spoke of things that mattered. As the conversation wove between laughter and confession, between silence and revelation, a moment arrived that Lucia had not anticipated, an internal shift so subtle yet so decisive that it stole her breath. She looked at Alejandro and suddenly saw him not as a man from a different world, not as someone she had agreed to meet out of curiosity or persuasion, but as someone whose presence felt inexplicably right, someone whose honesty touched her more deeply than she could express, someone she didn't want to lose, whether tonight ended perfectly or imperfectly, whether they ever saw each other again or not. The realization startled her, but it also grounded her in a way she hadn't felt in years. In the gentle quiet that followed a shared moment of stillness, Lucia understood the truth she had been circling all evening. She genuinely cared about this man, not because of what he could offer, not because of what he represented, but because of who he was. His lateness no longer mattered. His worn jacket no longer mattered. His different world no longer mattered. What mattered was the authenticity he carried, a kind of purity she didn't know she was starving for. And as the snow continued falling outside, blanketing the city in white, Lucia finally saw Alejandro's heart clearly and realized, with a delicate sense of wonder, that it was exactly what hers had been missing. By the time the waiter approached to ask if they wanted dessert, Lucia and Alejandro exchanged a glance that spoke louder than words. Neither wanted the night to end, though neither dared admit it aloud. There was a tenderness in the air now, subtle yet unmistakable, a fragile understanding that something meaningful had taken root between them. Lucia's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of her glass, and Alejandro noticed how she lingered in the moment, her posture relaxed, her expression warm in a way that made his breath catch. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if this night would become a memory or a beginning, but he knew that for the first time in years, he didn't feel out of place. And for Lucia, the presence of a man who didn't need to dominate the room to make her feel safe was a revelation she didn't want to lose. When dessert arrived, a shared slice of warm cake neither had truly ordered, they laughed quietly, almost embarrassed by how naturally the gesture felt. Lucia took the first bite, her eyes widening in approval, and then she nudged the plate toward Alejandro with an expression that felt strangely intimate. He tasted it and smiled, a slow, genuine smile that lit his entire face. "It's good," he said softly, and she nodded in agreement. The simplicity of that moment, two people sharing a plate on Christmas Eve, carried a tenderness that wrapped around them like a soft blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a group of diners began singing a carol. The melody floated gently across the room, adding to the warmth swirling between them. As the night deepened, the topics they discussed grew quieter, softer, no longer the big stories of their lives, but the small details that reveal a person's soul. Alejandro spoke about his favorite childhood memory, sitting on the roof with his mother to watch fireworks because they couldn't afford tickets to the festival. Lucia listened with her chin resting lightly on her hand. Captivated by the poetic way he transformed hardship into beauty. In return, she shared her secret refuge, a tiny balcony hidden behind her home office where she kept a single plant she never managed to keep alive but watered anyway, hoping that caring for something small might remind her how to care for herself. He didn't laugh or judge, he simply nodded, understanding instinctively what she couldn't say. The waiter returned subtly to refill their glasses, but Lucia barely noticed. She was too focused on the way Alejandro's eyes softened when he spoke, on the earnestness woven into every sentence. She had been courted by men with fortunes, reputations, and polished charm, but none had ever looked at her as though she were a person worth understanding, rather than a trophy worth displaying. Alejandro didn't admire her for her power, he admired her for her presence. And she, in turn, admired him for his humility, for his resilience, for the unwavering responsibility he carried with love rather than resentment. Sitting across from him, she felt seen in a way she had long ago convinced herself she would never experience. At one point, Alejandro glanced toward the window and noticed the snow falling heavier than before, transforming the sidewalks into soft, glimmering pathways. "It looks beautiful," he murmured. Lucia followed his gaze, and for a second, they simply watched the snowfall together, their silence warm and unforced. There was something symbolic in it, two people from different worlds gazing at the same quiet miracle, as if the universe itself were acknowledging the connection forming between them. Lucia brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and Alejandro found himself memorizing the gesture, realizing with a quiet ache that he didn't want this night to fade into something distant or accidental. The check arrived discreetly, placed between them with a practiced grace. Alejandro reached for his wallet immediately, instinctively wishing to contribute even if he couldn't afford the extravagance. But Lucia touched his hand lightly, stopping him with a gesture so gentle it startled them both. "Tonight," she said softly, "is my invitation." He hesitated, torn between pride and gratitude, but the warmth in her eyes dissolved any tension. Her generosity didn't feel like charity. It felt like a choice, intentional, respectful, sincere. And Alejandro, who had spent years fighting to maintain dignity in moments of scarcity, realized that accepting kindness could be its own act of strength. When they stepped outside, the cold air wrapped around them, crisp and fragrant with pine. The city shimmered under the soft glow of snow, lights reflecting like scattered stars across the wet pavement. Lucia pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, and without thinking, Alejandro offered his scarf, a simple gesture, yet one filled with instinctive care. She hesitated only a second before accepting, touched by the thoughtfulness. As she wrapped it around her neck, the faint scent of his cologne clung to the fabric, grounding her in the intimacy of the moment. They stood side by side, closer than before, watching as the world around them moved in slow, gentle rhythms. Neither wanted to say goodbye, though neither knew how to prolong the night without overstepping. Alejandro shifted nervously, unsure of what the right next step was. "Thank you," he began quietly, his breath visible in the cold air. "For giving me a chance. For staying when you didn't have to." Lucia felt her heart tighten. She stepped closer, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and answered, "Thank you for coming. For trying. For being honest." Their eyes met, and something new flickered between them. Something fragile, yes, but unmistakably hopeful. It was the look of two people realizing they had stumbled into something rare. Lucia sensed his hesitation and took the opportunity to ease it. "Would you like to see me again?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. Alejandro blinked, stunned not by the question but by the fact that she meant it. His smile grew slowly, radiating warmth he couldn't contain. "Yes," he replied, breathless with relief. "I would." A quiet laugh escaped her, light, melodic, genuine. It melted the last remnants of doubt between them. In that delicate exchange of vulnerability, they both recognized how improbable this night had been and how miraculous its outcome felt. As they walked toward the corner where their paths would diverge, the snowfall thickened, drifting gently around them like a blessing. Lucia paused under a street lamp glowing soft gold, turning to face him one last time. "Merry Christmas, Alejandro," she whispered, her voice filled with meaning deeper than the words themselves. "Merry Christmas, Lucia," he replied, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. And as they parted, slowly, reluctantly, they both carried the same quiet certainty within them. This night had changed something. Not loudly, not dramatically, but profoundly. In the midst of loneliness, snow, and unexpected connection, two worlds had begun to intertwine, and neither of them wanted the story to end. The city had already settled into the stillness of late Christmas Eve when Lucia finally stepped inside her home again. Yet something about the air felt different, lighter, warmer, as though the cold hadn't followed her in. She leaned against the closed door for a moment, her fingers brushing the fabric of Alejandro's scarf still wrapped gently around her neck. It held the faint scent of him, a simple man with tired eyes and a heart full of sincerity, and for reasons she couldn't yet articulate, the gesture comforted her more than any luxury she had ever owned. She moved slowly through the dimly lit apartment, passing the perfectly decorated Christmas tree that no longer impressed her, because tonight she had discovered something far more precious than elegance: connection. Alejandro, meanwhile, walked home through the quiet streets blanketed in snow, each step imprinting not just footprints, but hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. His breath formed clouds of warmth in the freezing air, yet his chest felt strangely full, as though someone had placed a candle inside him and its flame refused to flicker out. He thought of Lucia's smile, soft and shy in ways she likely didn't even realize, and her laughter, so genuine it felt like a gift. He imagined telling Mateo, not the whole story, but enough to plant joy in his son's heart. For the first time in a long time, Alejandro didn't walk like a man surviving. He walked like a man beginning. Back in her apartment, Lucia slipped out of her coat and paused before the balcony window. Snow fell in gentle waves, covering the city in quiet white. She touched the glass, cold against her fingertips, and felt the faint echo of a realization. She was not unreachable. She was not as alone as she had feared. Tonight had shown her that someone could see her, not the title, not the image, not the expectations, but her, the woman behind all the layers she'd spent years perfecting. And that revelation, delicate yet profound, brought tears to her eyes, not of sadness, but of release. Alejandro reached his small apartment, unlocking the door softly so as not to wake Mateo. But his son stirred anyway, rubbing his eyes and sitting up in bed. "Papi, you're home?" he murmured sleepily. And in that instant, with his son's tiny voice filling the room, the entire night crystallized inside Alejandro. He knelt beside the bed, brushed a hand over Mateo's hair, and said, "Yes, hijo." And tonight was good. Mateo smiled, satisfied with that simple answer, before slipping back into dreams. Alejandro watched him for a moment, overwhelmed by love and possibility, grateful that this night, this unexpected, imperfect night, had offered him a beginning instead of disappointment. In her bedroom, Lucia sat before the mirror, not to check her reflection, but to study the unfamiliar softness in her own eyes. She had not worn armor tonight. She had not needed to, and the world had not collapsed because of it. She thought of Alejandro's nervous apology, his stories, his laugh, his honesty, and felt warmth stir beneath her ribs. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew she wanted there to be a next. And that desire, gentle, hopeful, entirely hers, felt like a miracle she hadn't expected to receive. Two people, shaped by different worlds, ended their nights in separate homes. Yet both felt the same quiet truth pulsing in their chests. Something had shifted. Something had begun. Christmas Eve, with all its hidden magic, had taken two lonely hearts and placed them in the same moment, the same conversation, the same fragile hope. And no matter what came after, neither of them would wake up tomorrow as the person they had been yesterday. For the first time in a long time, Both Lucia and Alejandro drifted to sleep with the same thought resting gently inside them. Maybe love doesn't arrive when life is perfect. Maybe it arrives when two imperfect souls finally look up at the same time. And on that night, under the quiet snowfall of the city, two futures, once distant, once unimaginable, quietly began to intertwine. If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, understood, comforted, or if it reminded you that unexpected moments can change everything, subscribe to our channel. Here we share stories that heal, stories that embrace, stories that remind us of the beauty and fragility of being human. Every week, you'll find new narratives that warm the heart and stay with you long after they end. Join our community. Let these stories be a safe place for your emotions. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this journey with us.